We had mentioned that the reason why Klal Yisrael, Yaakov and his family went to Egypt was because it was already decreed by the covenant between the parts at the time of Avraham Avinu that his descendants ultimately will be strangers in a land which is not theirs. They will be enslaved, they will be afflicted for 400 years, and after 400 years, they will go out with great wealth, great possessions. This was at the time of the culmination of the bondage. When we left Egypt after the 210th year was completed, we were told before we left Egypt to borrow the gold and silver vessels, the personal effects of the Egyptians. And we left Egypt with all this wealth, enormous wealth. The Midrash tells us that the least amount of wealth that every Jew took were 10 pack animals loaded with the gold and silver. This was the degree of wealth we took out of Egypt. But initially, the bondage was decreed because Avraham Avinu had asked a question which indicated a certain lack of trust in God. As we had mentioned, he'd asked, "B'mo'eda kirushena," when God said the land of Canaan will be his and his progeny throughout all the generations, he asked God, but how do we know it's going to be retained by us? Although God never said it was a conditional gift, and there was no inference or indication or allusion to this, why are you asking such a question? Because he did ask that question, it indicated a lack of trust at Avraham Avinu's level, and therefore God says, your children will be strangers in a land which is not theirs for 400 years. So of course the obvious question is, if we only spent 210 years in Egypt, how do we satisfy the number of 400? God said 400 years. Ger yeh zaracho. Arba meo shana, 400 years. So the Maral explains, and it's something very interesting, what is bondage, what is affliction? What is being confined at a level which is painful and almost intolerable? The holy patriarchs, because of who they were, their level of spiritual attunement and sensitivity, living in a pagan culture, being exposed to depravity of Canaan, it was worse than physical torture. It's something which they abhorred. It's something they had difficulty tolerating. They tried to impact on the society, and they were effective to a degree. But the vast majority of people were involved in every abomination which one could imagine, and even what we can't imagine. So therefore, the bondage started with the birth of Yitzchak. Ger yeh zaracho, you will be strangers when you will have a child. This is the birth of Yitzchak. This is when the 400-year period began. And as the Baral explained, it was true affliction, it was true bondage. So why did things change after Yaakov and his 70 members of his family went to Egypt? And the Torah tells us it was only after that generation passed away that they enslave, that they appoint taskmasters over the Jew to produce quotas of brick and mortar. Then it became a physical bondage. Why the transition from the spiritual bondage to the physical bondage. So it's very interesting. Initially, the Midrash tells us the Jews were revered by the Egyptian people. They admired Yaakov and his family, especially being the family of Yosef, who was the viceroy of Egypt. If not for Yosef's divine genius and his overseeing the famine and the plenty, Egypt would have perished through starvation. Egypt became the mightiest power and the wealthiest nation in the world only due to Yosef's financial acuity, expertise, that he gathered the wealth of the world to Egypt. And this is Yaakov's father and his siblings and their children and their families. They were seen as special by the Egyptians. When did the change take place? So the Midrash tells us that after Yosef and the generation passed away, the Jews said, we want to be like the Egyptians. And they stopped circumcising themselves. If your level of acuity is that you cannot tolerate anything which is contrary to spirituality, that's bondage. But the moment you're drawn into the culture and you become acculturated and you admire and you aspire to Egyptian values in terms of physicality, in terms of material, now what initially was the most extreme negative setting becomes something very positive and pleasurable for the Jew. God says if that is the case, the Egyptian experience is no longer bondage. Now it's become paradise. So how do you turn paradise into bondage? Therefore, at that moment, the Egyptians began seeing the Jews in the most negative light, as a threatening element, as a fifth column, that ultimately, because of their degree of proliferation, they will take over the country and drive the Egyptians out of the country. And therefore they despise the Jew, and they enslave the Jew, and put upon them impossible quotas to destroy them and ultimately control their numbers.